and build the project. If not, you can do it while I'm talking, and that's fine. I'll try not to talk too much. It's the first time we've tried a lunch Sioux Falls Devs meetup. Is it the first time?
Yes.
Probably. Yeah, sure. First time that I remember.
You may be muted.
Well, this one isn't muted, and my local computer is muted, I believe. So are we still good online? Mic check. Someone want to give me a mic check again, Cassidy?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Hey, Cassidy. All right. So, and we also have 10 people on the team. Quinn's here and I'm here, so that's 8. So that's exciting too. Were you able to hit the recording button?
Yep.
All right, so we will have it recorded.
We'll see how that goes.
We'll see how that goes for sure. So again, definitely thank you to Raven. Did I miss anyone? I know Seth, Ryan, Jackson, Quinn were all helping out when I brought up the idea. Anyone else? Cool. So yeah, definitely join the sfdevs.com, get on the Slack group. There's a lot of good conversation going there. I enjoy that conversation there. So first thing that'll tell everyone I talk to when you're thinking about unit testing is buy the Art of Unit Testing book and do it as a group. I know everyone who comes to Omnitech, we're gonna pretty much get them this book now because it's got a lot of good stuff. It tells you what a unit test is, how to get started, what it's all about, even has some how do you help your team change and be an agent of change and the benefits of unit testing and stuff. So that's a little bit more about me. I like to tweet on Twitter every once in a while. My name's Kevin. I've been here since 2007, all at Omnitech. Here's my slightly outdated picture of my family. The kids are getting older all the time. And my high-powered presentation OneNote system. So, open the door there. Sorry about that. So, I grew up in Madison, but I did not go to DSU because that was in Madison. And SDSU was all the other third of my classmates. So I went to Morris, Minnesota. So technically I have a Bachelor of Arts in Computer Science, so don't hold that against me. That's my kids. They're 11, 9, and 5. We have a 6th grader next year already, which is crazy. So we're gonna, we got, what did we say, till 1:15? If you need to leave early, please do. You're not gonna offend me at all. And I'm gonna do a few background things, just the minimal background, and then hopefully you can follow along, and a lot of it's kind of copy, paste, and comment. What we really want to give you is an idea of like, how do I write this first unit test? At South Dakota Code Camp, I talked about, I know I should unit test, but we all have these reasons not to, time, we don't know what we're doing. Come on in, no problems. And so then I hope that you'll be able to go back to work and say, well, I'm writing this new piece of code, somewhat complex. I'm going to write a unit test around it. It's not going to be quite as simple as my contrived examples, but it'll get you moving and then start thinking, and then you'll buy the book and you'll read the book and you'll share it with others, and then I can go into a different company because Omnitech we do staff aug and help people out. I can go to your company and you're like, hey, we have unit tests already, and I'll be like, yay! I don't have to do my fear-driven development that I sometimes get into, which means I'm going to break your stuff because it just happens. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about. First off, this is pretty cool, neat thing. You might want to pull up command line somewhere, anywhere. It doesn't really matter. I like to throw some stuff in C drive get, and I'm using Commander, which allows you to do a lot of cool stuff. Looks like the Windows command line thing is going to be pretty cool whenever that comes out. But you can type in, if you're going to create a new test project, just do .net new MS test. And actually, there's a whole bunch of options with .net new. So we're talking about .net core. And you can say like MS test or NUnit or XUnit. I've just landed on MS test because it's gotten pretty good lately. So .net new MS test. And there we have our first test project created from that, ready to go. And I probably should have given it a name. So if you do -O, it's going to throw it into a directory and not mess up your directory like I just did. So let's see what it spits out there. So now it's got, get CS proj, and a bunch of other stuff that was there before. And go. So let's talk about naming a new project. You're excited about writing tests, so you're going to say, okay, let's create a project. I usually end up calling them something like API.tests, or maybe it's it could be Omnitech.website.tests or Omnitech.whatever API that does this. Hopefully, you might have this giant thing, you might have little things, so we can organize them that way. And another thing that he suggests is having your integration tests separated from your unit tests. We'll have to define that term a little bit here, but because integration tests are likely going to run longer, they're going to take a little more time, a little bit less easy to run. And then UI tests, if you get some UI tests, you want to keep those different. So let's talk about what a unit test is, and then we'll go talk about that a little bit. So I copied this out of the book. Unit test is an automated piece of code that invokes the unit of work being tested and then checks some assumptions about a single end result to that unit. A unit test is almost always written using a unit test framework. It can be written easily, runs quickly, it's trustworthy, readable, maintainable, it's consistent in its results as long as production code hasn't changed. So giving you a little snippet out of the whole book, right? So we're talking about little pieces of code. 2 + 2 is going to be 4 is a really contrived example, something small that isn't going out and calling the database or isn't calling the file system or isn't calling an API out somewhere out there. You have full control of that piece. And Martin Fowler has this testing pyramid. Really, we want to have more unit tests to build up the base, all the Lego pieces. Integration piece would say, let's put those pieces together. When I call an API, it actually returns what it does, and then it does something. And a unit test would say, I don't care if that API is running. I'm just going to fake that out and return you a list of, I could return you a list of 1,000 objects. I could return you a null. I could return you this. I'm going to handle those little pieces. And then UI tests, a lot of people invert this and have more UI tests, but they're flaky. You have to deploy the app first to run the UI tests. They take longer to run. And so even like the Azure DevOps team, I've heard that they've gotten rid of all their UI tests and they have 60-some thousand unit tests that run on every pull request. And they're able to release this massive software every 3 weeks or even more often. So those are some examples that why that. So we're looking at focusing on unit tests and not the other ones right now, but maybe next week we could talk about some of that stuff. So organization is important. You want to know where your tests are so you can run them and so you can add to them, or if something breaks, all that goodness. So we want to treat our test code the same as we treat any production code. It's going to be in source control. It's going to live alongside of our real code. We're going to refactor it and make it readable, maintainable, trustworthy. Because if it takes someone a long time to read that test and it gets out of whack, it's going to lose its value quickly. This is an MS test thing. You just throw that on top of the method. And then I like to use these test categories with a static class that would say, like, this is my shopping cart test. All these tests are related to shopping cart, or all these tests are relating to checkout, or all these tests are related to sign up, or whatever. And then, so you're going to see this also in my tests is I have an arrange, act, assert comments. You can leave out the comments too, but this helps me think through. I'm going to set up the test, I'm going to act on something, and I'm going to assert something. So I'm going to show you that. Hopefully it cements a little bit in a few minutes here. And then how do we test this thing? He talks a lot about a unit of work. Might be a class, it might be one method, it might be several methods calling each other. So we're going to try to name the method, which is the test, in a way that I can look at that thing and say, oh, that's what it's supposed to do. So unit of work, here's what I'm trying to do, and here's what I'm expecting out of it. So I don't have to go through and read all the code. Any questions about that? This is like the 2-minute version of a 10 years of learning type of thing, right? It's called the art, so it's not a science, but if you're lost, hopefully some code examples will help, but any general questions now? Okay, I felt like I had to give some background on some things. All right, so I really didn't pause long enough. All right, awkward silence. All right, we're good. Okay, so a lot of times when I talk about unit testing, people are like, well, what should I test? Do I have to test that? Why are we doing automated tests on if you're just doing CRUD and you're using Entity Framework and you're returning, the first one, do you really need to write a test around that? Maybe it depends, but what's really important is that you know what your business wants and what your user story is asking you to do. So some ways that I do that is called like Gherkin. Given, when, then. So given that, I don't have a good example, given that the user adds a book, when he's already bought 100 books, then he should get a discount of 20%, right? So that would be a business rule. A user can, or a tester can see that, a developer can see that, the person who wants the feature can see that, and we can agree to it. And maybe if you write some tests right, you can then codify that and say, this is my living documentation, and this is always going to be true. And there's systems you can use to write tests this way, but most of the time I write it the other way and just the pieces build it up. So maybe an integration test would say these types of things too. Still playing around with that. If you're interested in that idea, there's a book called Specification by Example that really talks about getting to living documentation with automated tests. But we're going to look at my code that I have on GitHub. We're going to start at this weather controller. I'll give you a brief run through of what maybe that does, and we're going to start at the top level down because it's still kind of contrived, but maybe you could start at smaller pieces with test driven and write your tests as you go. We're kind of in the middle right here. So yeah, and I just said, sometimes if your cyclomatic complexity is 0, maybe it doesn't need a unit test. It just all depends on what you're doing. So, and then I have another client thing there. All right, let's go and look at some code because that's why we came here. So, yay, all right. I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio. Here's where you can get your Visual Studios ready. And font size, how about in the back? Should I bump it up? Yeah, no problem. Let's try 150. Good? All right, cool. All right, so I am in this. I started with a bike tracking idea, but like all good intentions, I really didn't get very far. Some good intentions, so really I just have a small piece that has a few tests around it to allow me to see what I'm doing. So if we look at this solution, it's .NET Core 2.2. Doesn't really matter for this presentation. I have an API, something that you can call HTTP calls and bring things back. And I have a web project that really I just said file need project web. There's really nothing in it, so we're going to ignore that. And look at that. So this API's job, let's see if I had a little bit here. Oh, I didn't get that in there, but the API's job is to go out and hit this IP, what's it called again? IPIUX. It's a free endpoint that I could go out and get the weather for a zip code. So I thought, I like to ride my bike to work and I like to enter in, hey, I rode 3 miles today. And I usually put in it was 50 degrees and it was 60 degrees in the afternoon. Hopefully warmer today, but probably not. And then I like to look back at the past years and say, oh, what was the temperature? And I thought, well, it'd be cool if I could call an API and get it. So that's kind of the idea of this controller. So I've made up the business rules for myself. So that's where we're at. If you look in API, you're going to see weather folder, and then here's where the weather controller is, MVC API, dotnet framework, block. We don't really care, but that's what it is. So let's look at, first test we're going to write is around getting the current temp. Okay, so it's kind of laid out for you already. We got some stuff commented out. And so there we go. It's going to go out and hit the API and bring back something. So first test I might write. Are you ready for our first test? And then we'll talk about some more. I'm going to call this test weather controller, okay, because that's my unit of work. Weather controller plus get current temp is my unit of work. He's got a test method on it, and the class has a test class, and the category is weather API, function key. So that's what my test categories start to look like. And right now it's set to fail because I haven't written it yet. So my business rule might be, so given an API call to this guy, when asking for the current temp and no zip code is given, then it's going to return a 400. Someone said that was important. So I don't know what you have in here, but if you don't have, it might be assert.inclusive. So assert is stuff that people give, or that comes with MS Test. With different frameworks, you'll see different things. But if you change that to fail, okay, and then I have Visual Studio 2019 preview updated last night, so it looks a little bit different than what you have, which was kind of interesting. But you can say like run all tests. It's going to look a little bit different. But if you hit run all there, it's going to build your project, and it's going to look for any tests that have test method on it, and then run that test. And you should get a yellow if you say inconclusive, or a fail if you have it failed this way. There's different ways to sort this stuff. For some reason, this new one removed the way to sort by the test categories. Hopefully they'll add that back in. But does people have a failing test or an inconclusive test? All right, exciting, isn't it? So we have a failing test. Here's a pretty cool thing about Visual Studio 2019 and above is you can do this thing called live unit testing. So you go to your test menu and live unit testing and hit start. And if all goes well, it will build your solution, and then see these indicators on the left and right. They say it's not covered yet. It should run the test and then tell you that it's failed or not. It might have problems with that inconclusive. So there we go. It says this is excluded. I don't know why. So I'm going to right click. You can say live unit testing, include or exclude different projects. So I could say only include API tests to get live unit testing running. And then it's a great tool when it works. Otherwise, you can hit run all the time, which is fine. And it worked last night for me, so we'll see again. For some reason, that's excluded. Looks like there's also an option here to say include. Sit stop. Let's say live unit testing, include. And with the preview, they have this new view and just a way to see thing. Now, failed. All right, we'll see if it starts coming in. All right, let's write the test. We got it failing. TDD would say fail the write test that fails, and then write one that passes. All right, so the first thing, I come in here, and I have a snippet in Visual Studio. Used to. All right, well, we'll copy in. Usually I hit AAA, and I get range act assert, and then I hit tab. And I didn't try that again last night. That's fine. So we're going to say assert, act, arrange. Their Visual Studio Live testing kicked in and said it's green now because I'm not asserting anything, so I guess that means it passed. So, whoops, sorry. Got that mixed up. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to create a weather controller so I can call the method on it. All right, so var, and this is where you can come down and copy things. I'll just kind of use a little bit of copy so I have less typing. Let's talk about this line. All right, so at the top of my methods, I usually put like a factory method on top of here. Pretty simple. Its job is to create a weather controller and return it back. This parentheses stuff is a tuple, so it's allowing me to pass more than one thing. And so I put that factory up there because what if weather controller all of a sudden needs another class injected? It needs to do more things. So if I had that in every line of every test and I had 20 tests in here, I'd have to go and change it everywhere. So I just put this factory on the top and it starts to give me consistency. The weather controller needs to have this client, which will go out and get stuff. If I had done this a little better, I would have left this out and brought it in later. But this is using a framework called MOQ to say, hey, when anyone asks for this interface, I'm just going to give you a fake thing. We don't have to worry about it for this test, but we'll talk about it in a few minutes. So the weather controller takes in something, right? He needs an interface of a client, and it's just not used yet. So that's what we got going on there. And then I return that weather controller for later. But all we care about here in this test is the weather controller. Okay. All right. So there's our arrange. Have I completely lost people? Does that kind of make sense? I need to construct the object I want to test so I can call the method. And here's where, like, the first time I did the workshop, I had people typing along and they were scrambling along. So then I made a copy paste and then it becomes less of a like hands-on, right? So I don't know the balance of it. But maybe you want to type this in, or if you're watching, it doesn't matter to me. So I'm going to call the weather controller current temp, and I'm going to pass it 0. And yes, my zip codes should probably be a string so that I can use it with something else. It's an async class. If we look at the interface, so I have to do async await, and that's going to return me a result. Okay, and now let's make it fail. So we're going to assert dot, let's see, we said it returns a 400, so r equal 400, and then I forget the syntax right offhand. MVC API returns some result object that has a result on top of it, and then I can cast it as a bad request object result and a status code, and there it failed. All right, so we got a real failing test, and it's a null reference exception. Okay, well, it's kind of nice. I learned that without even having to build it. You know, I could have spun it up, and I could have fired up Postman, and I could have pointed it at the endpoint, typed in, you know, localhost API, whatever, and then got my thing. But I got it in 2 seconds, well, less than a second, without having to build. This live unit testing is running as we save it. Hey, we got a failing test. So let's make sure we're validating against zip code of 0. Okay, so then we say, whoops, this needs to be bad request. And let's see what zip code, name of zip code. It doesn't like zip code because I lost my casing. I hit the wrong keystroke. Okay, so there we go. We got a green test in 2 seconds, and now I know that anytime someone sends me something what I've deemed as bad, It's going to be a 400. I never have to test that again. Simplest test you could think of, right? So there I'll pause for a second too, and questions. Is it building for you? Ready to say why is this useful? Yes, please.
Is your mock framework included in MS Test, or is that something different?
Great question. This one is called MOQ, and there's another one called Fake It Easy, and there's also some more, but those are the top two. So you add them as a NuGet package. Let's look at that quick. So I haven't gone out and found MOQ. I like Fake It Easy. It doesn't confuse the word MOCK with fake with seams and all that other stuff. But I don't know if they have like downloads here, but it's in like the 12 millions. So you're a pretty safe spot to use it. 56 million, and the ideas are the same. The syntax is just a little bit different, and this has 3.75 million.
Are you going to have an example adding behaviors or attributes to a mock object?
Yes, let's try to get to that. Yeah, cool. That was such a simple example. It's like, how do I get just the flavor, get your feet slightly wet, and then we'll move on. So let's do that one next, and we'll talk about how we have to look for those things. So I'm going to uncomment this. I had inconclusive before, but I noticed that if live unit testing ran it, it would exclude it. And then I'd have to figure out how to get it included again. I saw that last night. It was really weird. So we'll just... And that's newer too with the update last night, is that it'll actually show you it's excluded. And it's like you got to kick it 500 times to... Let me try one more time. Yeah, so I think the message is don't use assert inconclusive. It's really unfortunate. All right, so given we're calling the API, maybe not the best given in the world, and we're asking for the current temp, and then it's going to call it with a correct zip code. So I'm trying to say, here's my unit of work. I'm going to get the current temp. Zip code is valid. Maybe this is a better name for it. And then it calls that thing. All right, so let's write some tests. Let's write, I really missed that snippet already, because I do AAA tab and we'll get it, but fine. I don't use this machine all the time. Assert. So pretty much a range act assert is really the given when then. It maps pretty well. And it's if you want to write a lot of tests and have them all green, you just don't do an assert, and you can show your boss, hey, look how many tests I wrote. It won't help your code coverage, but that's right. The other nice thing about this is you saw that like these greens show that I've actually written a test for it, and a dash means I haven't. So I've set it up so I could probably write the code that says, if the zip code is okay, let's just return okay, but we're going to go beyond that. The range is going to be the same, except for I'm going to care about what this thing was called. I think I have a cheater test down here. That's an interesting example. We'll look at that next. Okay, let's copy that in. So we know that 57105 is valid. We're going to call this thing, all right? So we need to, if we call our results, we'll call it here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll say weather controller dot get current temp, right? Oops, that current temp, and we're going to send it the zip code, and that of course has to be await. Oops. All right, so once we await that thing, we want to say it gives it calls something. So here we're talking about that faking stuff out. So I've injected a testing seam because I've given you an interface. It's also called the strategy pattern or dependency injection. If you got time, there's a weekly dev tips. I highly recommend. He does like 5-minute podcasts, and you can start at zero and just really get an idea. He's the guy who wrote docs for Microsoft on .NET Core. He's got a plural site on solid principles. So he knows what he's talking about. So go there, learn about strategy principle and stuff. But new as glue is something he'll say. So I could have said, hey, new API client, weather client, it's going to go out and hit that thing every time. But now my code is not testable. So as you're looking at code, you got to look for these test seams. Things like, am I tying myself to the system clock? You know, datetime.now is going to return right now, but what if I needed to make sure and thing happened in the past or in the future? You can wrap that somehow. Or API call or database call directly. I don't want to have to populate a database with 1,000 items just to get it to come back from my unit test. That's an integration test. Or write a file to the hard drive that requires configuration, takes a little longer, things get messed up, developers get mad because they have to configure the thing and it's failing them. Yep.
Not .NET-y enough to know. So your solution there is to pass the weather HTTP client into the constructor for that class?
Right. Yeah, so most of the time you do it, throw it into the constructor. I think with some you can pass it directly into a method. But yeah, most of the time I see it, I'll put it into a constructor. And then I have it lying around, and then we'll see where, you know, we could call it down here when we uncomment some things out. So instead of having new API, whatever, you know, there I'm glued to the real implementation. Here I can, you know, replace that with some fake thing or in-memory thing or blah. So that's a key thing when you're looking to test code. And when you have a bunch of existing code, it probably doesn't have these. So you have to be ready to wrestle with that code for probably hours and refactor. And then you have to tell your QA people, hey, I refactored this thing, so you have to retest everything. So you got to be mindful of that. So we got this fake thing, and it's returned back here as a mock. I don't know if you can see that there, but it's a mock of iGetWeather client, which is our framework is doing that. And with MOQ, there's a way to say, hey, or any of these fake things, when I call this, return something else. So I'm saying, hey, weather client, when I call get current temp async, return 72.6 degrees. And don't even worry about the real implementation. So now I call that, and I call the get current temp, and we are then, another way you can go is, then you can verify your mock that says, make sure that get weather HTTP client was called with get current temp async with this particular zip code one time, or never. There's a lot of options there. Or you can say .is any, because maybe you don't care what that thing is. So there's a lot of different options you can do there. So for this test, my requirements were, when I call that thing, it's going to return the zip code that I expected. A little bit contrived too, but you can see how you could have multiple external dependencies that return a bunch of things, and you have to act on them and return some sort of data that way. So this is going to fail, I hope, even though it still says it's excluded. So if I run these, oh, that's the live unit testing one. So you can run them with live unit testing, or you can go back to your test explorer and hit run all. Looks like it might be picking it up. Nope, it's not this time. So we'll run it this way. Okay, so this failed. The Test Explorer here, if you don't have that, I should have shown that. You can go to your test menu, Windows, Test Explorer, or you can always go Control Q and type in Test Explorer or whatever you need to find. That's pretty slick. So here it's showing that I expected this invocation of the mock 1 time, but it was 0 times. And this I was trying to call get current temp async 57105. So it wasn't called, which is true because we haven't put the test in yet. So let's call the actual thing and make this thing pass. And there, green, it went run here. Boom. So now we have 2 tests passing, and we have a weird live unit testing. Even on a small project, I still have weird things going on. All right, let's recap, and then we got time for like 1 or 2 more tests. And yeah. So we set up our thing, we arranged it. We said, I'm going to call the get weather. We faked out the get weather API call to get current temp, because really you don't even know what this interface is yet. I haven't even showed you it. So that's another benefit. Like maybe some guy's supposed to write this API and they just haven't yet, right? So I can start to set up things the way I assume they could be. And then as long as you both agree to that same contract, you could write most of your code before they even finish their work. So we faked that out. We said it's going to return a fake temp. And then we're going to call the code, the unit of work. And I'm going to verify that it was called 1 time with this zip code. So that's a way to test an interaction between 2 cases. So that's how I approach that. Let's keep on going unless there's any questions on that concept.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
On the assert there, you have a times as once. Is that, I'm just wondering why you would, other than not ever calling that internal method, would you ever say times more than once?
I haven't, the only ones I've really used is never and once.
Okay.
But they have, someone has built it out, you know, that you can do like at least once, at most once. Maybe you have some retry logic that you say it through something and I'm gonna retry again.
Okay.
But in that case, you might want to use a project called Poly, and they do all that stuff for you. Which if you've heard of Carl Franklin, his .NET Rocks guy, his company has put this Poly thing out. But so that's just because of retries. But yeah, good question. I might say, you know, there's this instance where I never want to call that because you shouldn't, you know, kick off some business process if it's got this rule, it's not valid or something.
Sure, that makes sense.
So that might be a good use for it. But or some for each loop and you're, you know, only make sure it's called once instead of 500 times. Some uses for that. But, the book talks about interaction tests versus like more direct tests, and this is an interaction test. So if we start to see too many of these, that's probably a bad smell in your tests, and you should maybe figure out how to test it more directly. But I'm testing the interaction, so that's where we have it here. Good question. Any more? Yes.
How is MS Test actually picking up on this and evaluating it when you don't have an assert statement? You're just using mock.
Yeah. Good question. I think in internals, mock must call some asserts. If we looked at their source code, there's probably something that a state machine that said, hey, this call was called with these pieces. That's another, you could learn how to write this by hand. So that in the book, it goes through that exercise of you could have something that said, oh, this method was called once in I could have a property in my controller class that says, how many times was this called? Increment that thing, assert that that property is 1. Good question. That hides all that handwritten stuff. Good stuff. I want to show you a nice feature that's been an X unit for years and years, but MS Test finally got it after a couple of years ago. So some people might say X unit seems to be the newer one. There was J unit for Java that we used in college. There's N unit, there's MS Test. Really, I think they're all kind of equivalent now. But there's probably some, I don't know, seems like the new cool kids are using X unit at Microsoft, but I just said MS Test. And either way, you just say file new project and choose what you want. So it's just some different terminology. I think I'm going to be lazy and just copy this whole thing. So this, if you scroll down, this one's called, there's got this data row stuff on top of it. And let's say that your QA people, because they're really good at finding crazy things, they say, well, you know, what if I pass in A, B, C, D to your thing? It allows it because your code just says it's only checking if code is 0 is a bad request. Well, someone might try to pass in other junk. So, and it caused some other thing up here and we returned a thing and we got an error. So you should just return a bad thing. So we say, okay, I got this test. It's pretty good, but I'm going to expand and improve the test. And so instead of no zip code, I'm going to say no or bad zip code, and that's going to return 400. And you could start to think of all the different possibilities of what you could pass in. And the QA people would give you a list of things they've tried because they like to do that. There's a feature in all of these that you can just start to pile up these data rows, and it will call them over and over. And see how it says 1 passed and 4 failed. There's a little. This UI is new too, but it's telling me he ran all these tests. Oops. With these values, but they failed. So like, hey, when I gave you negative 57105, it blew up with an object reference. I was expecting something else, a 400 that would come back. So you can imagine it just runs this one, then it runs this one, then it runs this one, then it runs one. Something I just noticed is that really, well, yeah, that's right. When I gave this last time, they said, well, why is int? Why is your zip code an int? Well, I didn't think about postal codes and whatnot. So we're okay with ints there. I thought maybe I had to make this string and then send an ABC or XYZ or whatnot. So if the requirement changed, I have this test and I could modify the test and handle those cases. So it's the same as before, arrange, act, assert. We've defined a few things that we thought were bad. Values, 0 is bad. These are all of these things should return a 400. 0, negative, 12, and then there, because I don't think that's a valid zip code. So instead of 0, we have to change our code to something else. I even Googled it and saw what's the max zip number, and if you're greater than that, it's not going to be valid. And there, I've written 4 unit tests in a few minutes, and now I know that my API doesn't allow weird zip codes, which could cause problems. So that's a pretty simple one too. And I think that's most of my examples there. Yep, we talked about that one. And valid zip code returns the actual temp. Oh, yeah, you might want to check. I've been checking the results, but if I wanted to check like that OK was true, we could run this one quick, see if that still passes. So makes sense to make sure that if I give it a valid zip code, it actually returns the temp I'm expecting. So same logic here. You see a lot of duplication, which, the drive principle, right? Don't repeat yourself, but you have to balance that with maintainability. And I could put this in a method that says take stuff in and do this and do that, but then quickly it becomes pass this parameter in here because in this case I want to do that, in this case I want to do that. But if you repeat yourself a whole lot, you might want to extract it into a method. Just treat it like normal code. So if I give it, something valid, that's valid. I want it to return the temp, and I'm just checking that the, okay result is there. What if I had accidentally hard coded this thing? It would be red. So it stops from dumb mistakes there. It also says someone can look at this thing and say, oh, I know you're returning a fake temp is a decimal or a double. And if they're changing what it's returned, then they have to ask themselves, is this really a good thing to change? There was assumption. What other parts of the system is this going to break? That's why we test the little pieces. I feel like I've talked a lot. I covered the basics there. So I feel with that, you could go in and you could find a piece of code and you could say, oh, I have a calculator code, or I have this internal piece that everyone's relying on. It's always a question of where do you start writing tests if they don't exist? Do you start with the most difficult stuff, which will take you a while, or the most critical, or the next bug is good? So if when you go back to work and they give you a bug, you're like, oh, that's where I could write a test. But your bug will probably take you 3 days instead of a minute because you could just put an if block in, right? But you start to think of all these possibilities. And, it takes a while to get the first one set up. And that's in the book too. So a question for you, I have some more around this client code that we could look at, a few more tests. Maybe we could do that for about 15 minutes and then talk a little bit about what we want to try to do next week, if we want to meet again next week. Or is there something else someone else wants to talk about right now? Yeah, Zach.
You've got a lot of weather controller, get whatever temp with a valid zip code.
Yeah.
Like 4 or 5 of those. Why not just do the setup once and then make all of your asserts all at once?
Like this block of code here?
Right. Why not just have one test method with 50 asserts?
That's a good question. For one reason, if you have multiple asserts, like if this one failed, the test method is not going to run the next line because the test runners throw an exception and just stop. So you could be hiding a piece of information you need to actually fix the bug. So it could become whack-a-mole. So that'd be one reason. Did you have another thought on that? Or
Well, I think you're looking at the test and seeing what it does. That might make it a little more complicated.
yeah, if you have more asserts, then. But if you had like a group of logic that you said that it has to be all of this to be valid, like you're checking 10 properties, 50 properties, like makes sense. One suggestion in the book, right, was to write have an object and do object equality. Say, hey, this is a whole set, so you only have one assert there. But, yeah. So the rule of thumb is probably as few asserts as you can in each test. Unit tests run in 4 milliseconds. So if you have 900 of them, that's great. Problems with that is if you make the wrong assumption somewhere and then you have 500 on that assumption, you might have a lot to go back and fix. And that's where this balance of art is like, you want the test to be valuable to test your pieces and to give you confidence that I can check this in, but you don't want, one line of code caused 500 to fail, so my other developers are going to hate me because they have to make this pass before they can check in. Which another point is that we could maybe talk about next week, but if you don't have a build that runs these tests, your tests are quickly going to become unusable because the next guy is going to say, oh, yeah, I'm just going to check in my stuff. And oh, then you get latest and you're like, oh, my test failed. And you got to go back to that guy. And then the process doesn't work. So you could definitely look at like Azure DevOps and setting up a build next week and do it in less than 5 minutes. So that's another thing to look at. Good question. Thanks, Zach. Hey.
So if you're in a team that maybe they have like a large project already and they don't have any tests already, how do you kind of get everybody on board with starting tests, or how do you get that mentality in there? Kind of more as like a soft skills type.
Yeah,
approach.
That's a great question. And I was hoping we can talk about it too now, but next week I was hoping that you guys would bring back some of your experiences with it, what you like it, what you hate it. We're going through this thing at Omnitech right now, and at another company I'm working at is like, how do we get the team on board with writing tests? We know it's a good thing because our regression thing is out the window, or someone comes on later and they have to do it, and it's gonna take more time to write tests. But you're testing anyways. You're clicking through the UI, you're running stuff, and the benefit with testing is that you are running 100 different things in 1 millisecond rather than one thing in 5 minutes. So presenting some of the ideas, there's some studies in here that show, it's going to take you longer, took the team longer, but their defects were less and their integration time was less. So even though you're in development phase longer, you have the benefits over time. So you're talking about being that agent of change. And sometimes it's a little bit of nudging and the river's going one way and you start to dig the trench and you see what comes after you. Sometimes you can get someone tall up above to say, hey, this is what we're going to do because we need the quality. So think about that this week, because I think we're going to do this next week again. I hope you can come again, and I'd like to hear some stories on how some of you have experienced that or not. So we'll get some more ideas from that. Good question. Because if you're just the Lone Ranger and you're writing tests and no one else does, and then the manager says, why are you spending extra time on this? We don't think it's important. But if you get to a point where it's like, this is how I write code, and if I don't, I'm going to fail. That's where I try to be at. So, good.
Go ahead, Dan. Are you about to read Andrew's question?
Yeah, but go ahead.
You can go ahead then. Thanks, there was a question in the Teams meeting.
Oh, good.
Andrew Stelter. One of the issues I've had with unit tests previously is that it feels like it can make code really inflexible. But if we decide our fundamental design is flawed, will we have to go and rewrite 500 unit tests because we refactored this one class to be synchronous instead of async or whatever? How can you prevent situations like this? Are they inevitable? And is it an indication that not enough design was done up front?
This sounds like a battle-hardened friend here. He's gone through this, and he tries to address that in the book, and I don't have a good answer because I still think that the test I write would have to be refactored. Well, async, I mean, if you go from synchronous to async, that's a big thing. But if you think about, I think that's why it calls it the unit of work instead of class under test. If you think about that unit and maybe your tests are at a little bit of a higher level, then you can avoid some of that. I know there's people who have talked about that more, but that's a really great question. And I think that's probably a question which would stop someone from saying, my team is going to test, because what happens, yeah. And then when you start testing, you realize how bad your architecture is, and then you try to refactor it, and then hopefully it gets better. But, yeah. Thanks, Andrew. That was a great question. If you have more ideas, let's talk about it next week. Yes,
Do you think some of that has to do with just getting more accustomed to working with some of the tests? So like learning strategies just through group experience? Because some of the things I've seen with people testing, especially early on, is trying to replicate like logic in their tests that is logic and methods, which is obviously a failure because A, you're not really testing anything because you're putting the same stuff in the test that you're putting in the methods. But B, you also, are exposing, I mean, it's very brittle then.
yeah.
It's brittle and also not worth it, but I think, maybe it's just experience allows you to have fewer of those.
Yep, definitely. And you pinged one of the things he has in here. He has like things you should avoid, and one is definitely writing logic inside your test. Another one is faking, basically testing fakes, mocking everything out, and then you're like, what am I actually testing? If you're testing internals of a method, you don't have to test the private method. That should be able to change out, right? And you should be able to, I should be able to test this weather controller regardless of what that client looks like. So separating those concerns out helps a lot too. So. And it's, he has this picture of this guy, samurai guy, and so it's trying to indicate that you need to practice this stuff and you need to learn it as you go. And you need to do code reviews with your team with someone who knows what's going on, so they help you catch these things before they become more of a problem. Yes, sir.
I've written some unit tests, and there are a couple benefits. One is whatever code I do right, I have to test it one way or another. So starting with a unit test, I can go back and reproduce that test easily, 6 months, a year from now, whatever. And so if I'm gonna write a fake test, something like if I put a button somewhere and I click the button just to test my code, might as well make it reproducible.
Right.
So that's a huge one. And I forgot what the other thing was. Shoot.
Well, that's the biggest point. You guys, we're testing anyways,
Yeah.
right? Or at least we're supposed to be. And so why not have it reproducible that, like, you can remember 3 months, or for me, a couple weeks later. And then at my current place, a lot of people, there's been some turnover. So you say, well, how does this work? And you're looking at the code and you're like, I don't really understand, because there's been so many, they've been building pieces and shoving things in, and putting them together. And then you say at the end, I don't know, I can add my little thing, or I could write a test and say, here's how I know it works right now. And that's kind of my documentation for myself. It did this way. Why did I do this? Well, here's some reasons why. So that's a great point. So it might take an extra 30% on your development time, but hopefully you'll have less bugs from QA coming back. And if a bug does come back, you just add a little test for that thing. You can hit a breakpoint really quickly for that scenario. I'm working on a page where you could have multiple different scenarios in that thing. So I've just faked out the data, and I can load that page up and say, well, if it has this and this and this, it should show this, rather than going to something, setting it up, and then having 50 tabs open. And that's the only way. The item is taking way too long, but it's the only way I'm surviving and keeping my head on straight. A lot of benefits. Yeah.
Do you think that you should you should go for code coverage, or should you go more for these types of things, kind of hitting the business logic and kind of documenting that business logic through the test? Or maybe even just certain things that have been known to fail, or you think could be failure points. Which one do you think is more important?
Yeah. Has anyone been on a team where they said you have to have 90% code coverage? How did that work out?
We wrote tests for 2 weeks.
After the fact? Or?
Yeah.
So it was just a giant batch process and then 80% code coverage. So and part of that was the fact that we had a lot of stuff in static, called statically, and so we had to convince the overall team to move towards injecting services rather than referencing them statically and that sort of thing. We ended up writing 300, I think.
And when you hit 80%, did you say I'm done? Or did you say I know there's more?
Yeah, basically. It was just get as much of the code covered as you possibly could and don't let it fall below a certain mark.
Yeah. How about, you'd raise your hand that you code
Yeah.
coverage?
It worked pretty well, I think. I mean, when you get that many tests, they start to get really complex. So we did have to take some time to refactor our tests and implement different design patterns in the tests to make them readable because they were getting a little out of hand. But
Sure.
I think it made the code a lot better.
It's nice to have a
Making
metric.
changes a lot easier and faster.
Sure, yeah. It's nice to have a metric to shoot for. The thing, if you say 80% code, well, I can cover code. It's no problem. I don't have to have an assert on anything, So you could totally game that system. Not that you would, but you could have people do that.
It is easier to sell. It's easier to
Yeah.
show a
Oh, yeah.
client, we have this code coverage rather than just nebulously say, yep, it's covered by unit tests.
Right. And so you could have that as a starting point, but I think you also need to know, is this valuable, what you're getting to? Is this covering? I could have 80% code coverage, but 20% is my core business logic that I'm not covering. Is that valuable? It might be more valuable to cover 20% and leave the rest could just be CRUD stuff, but the core things I think is what you need to really focus on. But then you talk about, test-driven development, you just get in this mode of writing tests and get very good numbers then. Good. I know we have another 15 minutes, but I feel like it could be fun. So yeah, any feedback you have, if you want to throw it into that Teams meeting that Seth threw up, or on SF Devs, or threw up SF Devs, or tweet SF Devs, right, Seth, or I'll get it, or tweet me. So I think next time we have a lot of good questions we could talk about. So if you know some people that are more experienced in unit testing, this was kind of the introduction. Maybe we could try to get them going. If the team decides we need to wait something, or do you think next week is going to work again, or?
I think next week's fine.
Yep, it'll work.
We'll do some discussion, and then I'll have a .NET Core integration with in-memory database in my pocket. Run out of things to say. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.